It's really an honor to be here in so many ways, and I thank all of you for braving the lightning to be here. I want to thank the Center for Mark Twain Studies, Matt Sable, who invited me to come and give this talk, and Joe Lamack. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for making it possible for us to be here. And I want to also thank Steve Webb, the caretaker of the Quarry Farm cottage, although it's a pretty nice house to be called a cottage. And I've been staying there the last few days with my wife, and we'll be there for a few more days, and that has really been a magical experience, and an eerie one in some ways, to be in such an intimate space, a house that Twain spent so much time in. There are moments moving through it, especially for some reason for me coming down the stairs, when I can really feel his presence there. And it's been interesting the last few days to work on this talk in his house and the house of his wife, Olivia Langdon Clemens, and the Langdon family. I am not a Twain specialist, or really even a bona fide Twain scholar. I want to be honest about that at the start. But I did, a couple of years ago, I was working on an essay for HARPER'S Magazine, a review of a new biography of Twain that had come out. And it had me doing a lot of Twain-related research. And I wound up finding a Twain-related document that that was unknown to the scholars, and in fact had not been seen in the 115 years since it was published. It had not been seen for a very good and specific reason, namely that it was published in Pakistan, or what at the time was considered part of India before the partition, in a newsletter that was published in a British military, kind of British military gazette that had once been associated with Twain's friend Rudyard Kipling. And the story of how it came to be there, and of the document itself, which is a very interesting obituary essay about Twain, about Clemens, that was published just weeks after his death in 1910, is the story I want to tell you tonight. And it involves one of the most fascinating lost figures of American history I've come across in many years of doing this kind of research and a lot of historical digging, which most of my writing involves. And the person I want to tell you about, Dr. Adele Gleason, is a great daughter of Elmira, so it's especially meaningful to bring her story back to light here with you. And in fact, not just here in Elmira, but here in the very spot where she and her family lived for many decades. Their water cure sanitarium was just across the road here. But this story starts not in Elmira, but in a place called Bayview, Michigan. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's a Chautauqua, an old Methodist campground in Chautauqua, way up in northern Michigan. And Twain has a funny kind of association, or more like a non-association with it. In 1895, which is an important year in this story, he had just been financially obliterated by his unwise investment in the Page Compositor project. Some of you who are Twain heads may know about that. He invested a lot of money in a new kind of printing press, which you can actually see an example of at the Twain House in Hartford, Connecticut. I just saw it a few days ago. The Page compositor, unfortunately, had something like 150,000 individual parts, so it was more or less constantly breaking. And Twain was financially devastated by that and lost his fortune. So he decided to embark on, at a fairly advanced age, to embark on a journey around the world, which he would write about for different magazines, and he signed a book contract to publish his account of that journey, which became the book Traveling Along the Equator. And did actually recoup his fortune that way. He refused to go into bankruptcy. He saw it as dishonorable. He wanted to make the money back and actually repay his enormous debt. And it's one of the amazing things in his biography that he was able to do that. But he started out, and this is a lesser known part of that story. He started out not going anywhere far-flung, not traveling along the equator, although he did end up going all over the world. But initially he headed west, and he went to Mackinac Island. And in Mackinac, something very unusual happened. I'll start my slides here. I'm going to come back to this one. I promise it has to do with the story. It's not a mistake. This is his manager, J.B. Pond, who was traveling with him. Twain's wife and one of his daughters were also with him on this trip. And Pond, they went to Mackinac Island, stayed at the Grand Hotel, a very beautiful place, if any of you have been there. Pond wanted to get him booked at the Bayview Assembly at the Chautauqua, which was a place where famous late 19th century speakers and lecturers often were engaged to give talks, to lecture. Helen Keller went there, people like that. But this embarrassing thing happened. Here's a photograph that Pond, this is from the collection at the Center for Twain Studies. This is a photograph of Mackinac Island that Pond took as they were coming in on the boat in 1895. Pond wanted to get Twain booked at Bayview, at the Chautauqua Assembly, but this man, John M. Hall, whose name is still well remembered in Bayview, for some inexplicable reason declined to engage Twain. He said no. The most famous speaker in America. Hall gave the excuse that he didn't think Twain would draw enough of a crowd to justify the $250 speaker's fee. That was about $10,000 at the time, I think. So he rebuffed Pond and Twain by extension. So, and this gives you a sense of maybe the reason why Hall didn't want Twain at Bayview. You can see some of these names that were booked in 1895 to speak in Bayview. This is extremely dry and hoity-toity kind of entertainment. John Fiske, the famous historian of America, and people, George Kennan was there, whom Twain knew, and people talking about prisons and progressive social causes and things. So Twain wasn't really their cup of tea. His lectures at that time were mainly humorous. But I suspect that the real reason Hall said no is that Bayview just didn't have enough money. It was a lot of money, and they had already spent most of it on their list of speakers. So So Hall tells Pond, no, I'm sorry, you can't do it. So Pond pulls this move, an admirable little move, and books Twain at the Grand Opera House in Petoskey, Michigan. That's the town next to the Chautauqua. And sure enough, they fill it to the rafters. More people than had ever been, they got the biggest crowd that the place had ever seen. And made something like $750, made 3 times. I think Twain cleared more than 500. And was very proud of that, and of having put it to the snobs at Bayview for having passed him over. And he gave an interview to the local newspaper in Petoskey that night, the night of the talk. And I think he was feeling a little bit grumpy. He had a really bad infected carbuncle. He could barely walk, like a boil, and was probably in a bad mood. And he gave this interview, and he mocked Bayview and mocked this journalistic project that John Hall, the man, this man, that he had just started up. It was a newspaper. It was designed to be a teaching newspaper, and the idea was you got young people who wanted to get into journalism to write for it for free, on the pretext that they would be learning how to become journalists. So Twain thought that was very funny and thought, oh, that's a great scheme for getting free labor out of young people. Way to go, Bayview, Then he gets back to Mackinac Island. The next morning he reads the Petoskey newspaper, sees that he's been quoted, realizes that he sounds like a jerk. And Pond writes this letter to the people at Bayview saying, he never said those things, he's mortified. It's pretty clear that he did say those things and regretted it the next morning. But so anyway, that's how Twain almost came to have a connection with the Bayview Assembly in Chautauqua. People there, I go there every summer with my family has gone there every summer since, for more than 100 years. And people there will tell you a very different story that, you see in the books that Twain gave a talk at Petoskey, but he really gave a talk at Bayview, just that people don't know about Bayview, but in fact, that's not what happened at all. It was more the opposite than anything. But as I say, I go there every summer with my family, and I have a wonderful neighbor there, a next door neighbor, this man, Stan Sutton. The Reverend Stan Sutton and his wife Jerry, and those are my daughters, Jane and Maria, and he's about to take them down to the 4th of July parade, which he does every year in the golf cart. I found out that Stan was from Elmira, and we got to talking, and I said, "Yeah, I'm writing this piece about Twain for Harper's, and it has an Elmira connection." And he said, "Oh, well, did you know I grew up there?" He's from a very interesting family here. His father actually invented electronic fuel injection. And I was sure he was making that up or exaggerating it. And so I went and researched it right after he told me the story. Sure enough, it was completely true. Robert Sutton, you can look him up. Anyway, we got to talking about Elmira. The next morning, I went out onto the porch to walk the dog, and there was this gigantic book on the front porch that Stan had brought over and folded down one of the pages. And it was Twain's autobiography, the one that was published posthumously. And there is an amazing page in that biography. This page here that Stan had evidently wanted me to see. He's talking about his wife, Olivia, who struggled with ill health all her life. And he tells this remarkable story. They're in Buffalo at the time, in Buffalo, New York. The result to Mrs. Clemens was a premature confinement followed by a dangerous illness. And the context here is the birth of Twain's son, who did not live very long. One of the many extremely painful losses in Twain's life. But he tells this story. The result to Mrs. Clemens was a premature confinement followed by a dangerous illness. In my belief, there was but one physician who could save her. That was the almost divine Mrs. Gleason of Elmira, who died at a great age 2 years ago, after being the idol of that town for more than half a century. I sent for her, and she came. Her ministrations were prosperous. But at the end of the week, she said she was obliged to return to Elmira because of imperative engagements. I felt sure that if she could stay with us 3 days more, Livy would be out of all danger. But Mrs. Gleason's engagements were of such a nature that she could not consent to stay. This is why I placed a private policeman at the door with instructions to let no one pass out without my privity and consent. In these circumstances, poor Mrs. Gleason had no choice, therefore she stayed. She bore me no malice for this, and most sweetly said so when I saw her silken white head and her benignant and beautiful face for the last time, which was 3 years ago. So, very strange story. I've asked several people, including some Twain scholars, since Stan Sutton drew this to my attention. What do you make of this story? Is it a joke? Is he being funny? Did this really happen? I mean, it's so hard to believe that he would actually trap this woman in the house using a local policeman. And there was disagreement about it among the people I queried. And I'm still not totally sure myself. The tone of it suggests there's at least a grain of truth to it, that he didn't let her go. But this is a good introduction to the Gleason family. This is Silas Gleason on the right and Rachel Brooks Gleason on the left. These were two fascinating figures of Elmira history. They were healers. That's probably the best way to describe them. They were both doctors, both very well known and sought for doctors. Rachel Brooks Gleason on the left was one of the first 4 women, American women, ever to be officially, legally licensed as a practicing physician. She was a true pioneer. And in the 1850s, the Gleasons came to Elmira, right around 1850, in fact. And in the year 1852, which this advertisement is from 1852. This is the first advertisement of what they called the Elmira water cure, or in slightly more technical language, the Elmira hydropathic sanitarium. Now, hydropathy is a 19th century medical theory and practice that essentially at the root of it is the idea that all diseases can be cured by water. That diseases are caused by our falling out of sync with hydration. I mean, in a way, it's what a lot of people believe these days. If you have any friends who insist on drinking 8 gallons of water a day, they're kind of practicing, late stage hydropathic medicine. But the water cure was right across the road from here. I mean, if you stand on the porch of the Quarry farmhouse, you can almost see where it was located. And in fact, Twain used to take his baths there because there was no running water at the Quarry farmhouse in the early days. And he would often walk across the field, he and his family, and bathe at the hydropathic sanitarium, they had very nice baths, hot water. And then he would, there is a reminiscence that a woman wrote in the early 20th century who had stayed at the sanitarium as a little girl, and she remembered Twain sitting on the porch of the sanitarium having conversations with Silas Gleason, the husband of the couple you just saw a moment ago. So Twain very familiar with the Gleason sanitarium, and as you saw in that strange story from Buffalo, he really kind of worshipped Rachel Brooks Gleason almost, saw her as the one person who could keep his wife in good health, his wife who struggled with health problems all her life. And in fact, interestingly, Twain's wife, Olivia Langdon Clemens, had done multiple stays at the Gleason Sanitarium as a girl and young woman before she ever met Twain. She had slipped on the ice one time and hurt her spine very badly. That resulted in a long stay at the sanitarium. Another time she got Pott's disease, which is a kind of tuberculosis of the spine, and during that time she did another long stretch at the Gleason Sanitarium, during which her roommate was a very prominent feminist. In fact, I was going to read you this wonderful account that suffice it to say that the feminist, whose name was Isabel, was very high-strung and couldn't keep a roommate. Rachel Brooks Gleason kept removing her from the different rooms at the sanitarium where she was staying because she would just freak out her roommates. They couldn't deal with her level of intensity. And a big part of hydropathy was you wanted to maintain calm at all times. In fact, just a little tangent, hydropathy was interesting because it worked a lot better than most of the 19th century quack medical treatments because it did no harm. You know, the things it recommended, a vegetarian diet, a calm environment, avoidance of nervous overstimulation, lots of hot baths, lots of massages and things. All of it was pretty good for your health. So people did get better at hydropathic sanitariums, as you can imagine. They often improved, and it had a pretty good reputation. So it was different than some of the snake oil cures that it sometimes gets lumped together with. But anyway, Isabella, Mrs. Gleason finally put her in a room with Livy, with the future Mrs. Sam Clemens, and they got along fine. And Olivia was exposed then for the first time to fairly advanced progressive political ideas, including feminism and political equality for women. But the Gleasons were really extraordinary, and especially Rachel Brooks Gleason was a much respected, much sought after doctor, especially in treating women's issues having to do with reproductive health, childbirth. And she even pioneered a certain obstetric procedure that you can still see her identified with. But as I say, this is the advertisement announcing the construction of the water cure in 1852. And here's a sign that most of you have probably seen many times: Water Cure Hill Road, which again is just across the field here. They called it the Cure. That was how they usually referred to the hydropathic sanitarium, or the Gleason Cure, you often see it called. Here's a picture of it. I went looking for it today with a friend, and there doesn't really seem to be anything left of it, which is kind of remarkable when you look at what a significant structure it was. I wonder if it didn't burn at some point, but at any rate, it was completely leveled. There is a pond down at the bottom of Watercure Hill Road. And my suspicion is, I haven't been able to prove this, but having seen it now, I actually want to look into this after I leave Elmira. But I suspect that pond is spring-fed, and that it marks the spot of the spring, which was considered a very good, very pure spring. That was the reason the sanitarium wound up being established where it was. The reason they chose that spot. But people would come from all over, including some famous Americans of the second half of the 19th century. It was very well known and well regarded. Here's an interesting article that gives you an idea of how highly respected Rachel Brooks Gleason was. A little girl in the orphan school named this is from Mansfield, Pennsylvania, named Lucretia Robinson, who for a long time has suffered from an ugly sore on her leg, was taken to Elmira one day last week by Miss Dr. Beach and had the entire large bone of said leg removed at the Surgical Institute by Dr. Updegraff. He was assisted in the operation by Dr. Hall, Dr. Gleason, and Miss Della Gleason. Now, it's this Della Gleason who I mainly want to tell you about tonight. That is the daughter of Silas and Rachel Brooks Gleason, their only daughter. Her name was Adele Amelia Gleason. She was born on Christmas Eve in 1850. Here's a picture of her that was taken later in her life. I'll leave it there for a moment. Adele Gleason, Dr. Adele Gleason, was just an extraordinary person. She became a doctor like her mother, and in fact was often spoken of as being a kind of successor to her mother as a pioneering woman physician of that period. She studied at the academy here in Elmira, and then for a brief time at Elmira College, and then she went to Vassar, and then she wound up getting her medical degree at the University of Michigan. She was also a writer, an accomplished literary writer, who wrote a novel called The Georgia Belle. She wrote a lot of poetry. She was a lesbian, and an unusually out one, as we would say, for that time period. In fact, there's an interesting review that ran this is in the Elmira Telegram, 1895, a review of her novel, The Georgia Belle. And you can see that the writer sort of makes, not a joke, but there's a little kind of wink in the middle of the article. She says, "It is not at all out of place that so charming and handsome a woman should evolve the romance she has adroitly spun about the Georgia Belle." I should mention, Adele Gleason was a famous beauty in her time. It's something that you repeatedly run into in her biography. She's described as exceedingly beautiful by a woman who kept a diary that Gleason briefly passes through. And there's a story that President Garfield once put his head out of a train car in order to look at her as she was walking down the platform of the train station. So So the writer says this, that she is so charming and handsome a woman. And then this interesting sentence: it is more than suspected that Miss Gleason has an ardent fancy toward and a deep affection for the beautiful young women of Dixie. And we'll see that her sexuality is woven through her biography. The place that it appears probably most conspicuously is in a book of poetry that she published in the first decade of the 20th century. It's a strange book. The title is Sonnets and Verses for Christmas, but it has absolutely nothing to do with Christmas. In fact, there's no mention of Christmas in the book, but what there is a lot of deep, throbbing, erotic lesbian poetry, and with a kind of mournful tone. A lot of it has to do with broken affairs. You can sense a real depth of erotic grief in the poetry. Some of it, I think, is very beautiful. Here's one of her poems, a letter. I miss thee, yet would not recall, as one who largesse from a king receives, and cannot count his treasure, only grieves to see the royal presence vanish out of sight. And when the great one's gone indeed, counts up the sums of blessing with delight, nor ever thinks to ask for more. So hast thou left thy love's and wisdom's store for me to count alone, nor dare to ask for thy return. She was a good poet. It's maybe not great American poetry, but it's not hack work either. Some of it is very moving. This is something I found and wanted to share with you. And I have the original of this over sitting on the glass, if you'd like to look at it before you go. I'm going to donate this to the Center for Twain Studies when I leave at the end of the week. I found it on eBay. It was $75. But it's a letter written on Gleason Sanitarium stationery. And it's written to a woman named Miss Chapin, who I think, I've tried to figure out who this is. I think it's a woman from Boston, Mary Chapin, whose family would spend time in St. Augustine, which Adele Gleason's family also evidently did on occasion in the winters. They would go down to Florida. It's a very interesting letter. It's coded in a way. You can tell that she is infatuated with this young woman. She's complaining that she never hears from her. You might find time to dictate a telegram. I wish I was sitting on the seawall with you as this summer in St. Augustine, eating that ridiculous luncheon out of the widow's basket and throwing the pieces into the wide, wide sea. And then she says, have you yet married Mr. Cellender? I am so perplexed at you, my dear. I have been expecting the invitation to the wedding for some time. And then she describes her bed at the sanitarium here in Elmira. She says it's more comfortable than the double-decker one we slept in at St. Augustine. And then at the end she says, I hope you will come north and see me, for I shall never come within 1,000 miles of Florida again if I can help it. God knows what was behind that sentence. Now, it's interesting. My suspicion is that this letter was written right around 1900 or in the very late 1890s when Adele would have been in her late 40s. There is a letter written by Susan B. Anthony, which you can see in that glass case right over there. I was delighted when I saw that it was there, in which Anthony is describing her stay at the Elmira sanitarium. And she says Rachel Brooks Gleason was there with her husband had died, Silas, the husband had recently died. And she says Rachel Brooks Gleason was there alone with her invalid daughter. She's describing Adele Gleason as being an invalid, and I suspect that was the result of a nervous, what they call a nervous breakdown of some kind, which she had more than one of in her life. She struggled with mental health, and I sense it's pure speculation. There isn't enough biographical material to really justify it, but you sense that her struggles were tied up with her sexuality and the difficulty that she had living openly, and the many romantic disasters that she suffered. I said that she was forgotten. And that isn't totally true. And this is an interesting aspect of how she comes down to us historically. She is remembered for one reason. She is remembered in the world of New Age dream aficionados, people who are into psychic dreaming. And that is because of a very interesting experience that she had in 1895, again, a very important year in her life, and it ties her together with Twain. As you know, Twain was fascinated himself with what he called telegraphic dreams. He believed that people sometimes communicated through the dream world. He had a theory, Twain had a strange theory that when you received a letter, if you kind of lived with it for a while and kept it with you, you could determine or divine its contents without actually opening and reading it. This was a kind of pet theory of his. And he and Adele Gleason are actually mentioned in the same issue of one of the spiritualist magazines that were popular in the 1890s, in the year 1895, Twain's Interest in Dreams, and her dream. And this is the one little aspect of Adele Gleason's life that has survived. If you look her up on Google, for instance, this is the thing you'll find. She had this dream in which she was out walking, and she saw a man she knew, a friend of hers. And they were walking in the forest, and there was a tree there, and the tree and the leaves of the tree turned into flame in the dream, and it shook her. It was so vivid. And a couple of days later, she ran into the man who had been in the dream. And she said, I had the most amazing dream about you. And he said, don't tell me, because I know I had the same dream. And he described an identical dream. And then they started talking, and they realized they'd had the dream at the exact same time, which they figured out because of the sound of a passing train had happened right around that moment. And they went to a lawyer's office and both gave testimony about this simultaneous dream. And as a result, this account of this telegraphic dream, this simultaneous dreaming, it came to be considered one of the most trustworthy and authoritative accounts of that kind, at a time when people were having lots of debates about whether it was real or whether it was all just, in the mind. And so over and over through the years, when you've seen people argue about the dreams like that, they will often point to the Gleason account and say, well, you can't falsify that one. That's because she was a very trustworthy person and the lawyer verified it, and the whole business. But Adele was so much more than that, and I think really deserves to be remembered as an historical figure for her writing, for her life. She was very passionate about political causes, and also one of the most fantastically well-traveled people I have ever run across, much less when you narrow the field to 19th century American women. She had a very restless spirit, and you just find her all over the world. I mean, she went to Iceland, she went to Denmark, she went all over Europe. She went out to California, where she started another sanitarium. She actually bought the land out there from the son of John Brown, the famous John Brown of Harper's Ferry. Somehow she got to know him, bought a piece of land, started another Gleason sanitarium there. Started what she called a social service settlement in Buffalo, New York, that ran for more than a decade, that would take in orphans and young unwed mothers and other people who were in hard circumstances and teach them skills and rehabilitate them. Just an amazing person. A lot of times when I find her in the old newspapers in some random place, in Kentucky, for instance, she spent time in Kentucky, you can't even really tell what she's doing there. She's just constantly on the move, but she shows up in the social columns and things, and you can track her that way. One example I'll give you, because a person could talk about her travels alone for an hour, but she went to France during World War I and worked in a hospital on the outskirts of Paris, where wounded soldiers were being, very badly wounded soldiers were being brought in and treated. And I'll never forget finding her in that account. It was a newspaper article that was published in different newspapers across the country, and the reporter is there talking about the hospital and the war and these soldiers who are being treated, and then he just offhandedly mentions, oh, and then Dr. Adele Gleason came in from the bandage room. She walks in out of the bandage room, and so just a person who had a lot of amazing adventures. And that is how she came to be in India in the year 1910. She had just left Buffalo the year before and gone to India to work in a missionary school. She was teaching medicine, teaching obstetric medicine in India, in the southern part of India. And 1910 came, and Sam Clemens died. And she wrote this amazing obituary essay about him. And it was published in Pakistan, as I say, in the Civil and Military Gazette, a British military newsletter that was produced there, and lost for 115 years. So I just want to end by reading it to you, or at least a portion of it. It's about 1,000 words altogether. It's not an earth-shattering document when it comes to Twain's studies. It doesn't undermine any of our major assumptions about him, but it's very intimate. It includes some anecdotal material that I think will be woven into his biography eventually. And it gives a sense of her as a writer and as a person who I think we need to know more about. And I'm really hoping that this rediscovery of her that the document has made possible will lead to scholars taking an interest in her. She's someone who deserves to be resurrected as a literary figure, as a pioneering physician, as just for so many reasons, really. She says, the article is titled Samuel L. Clemens. And that's how I found it. I was searching around in a British newspaper archive on the name Samuel L. Clemens in 1910. I wanted to see what the British had said about Twain when he died and see if maybe there were any articles like this that had been missed. And sure enough, there was one that was much more wonderful than I could have expected. But she says, as I knew him, in the many summers he lived on estates joining ours in Elmira, New York, USA, his wife's birthplace, the wonder of Mark Twain's real personality increased. He reminded one of the many definitions of genius, a constant capacity for growth. The reproach of age is that it is stale, flat, and unprofitable. Mr. Clemens's age was always youthful, not in the way of amusement or of seeking amusement, for he seemed never to require them in an artificial sense. He found amusement and intense interest in everyday things about us and in everyday people, which those very people themselves were incapable of finding. I said once, Mr. Clemens, you have been guest of emperors and princes and presidents and magnates and artists, and yes, he broke in with a quizzical smile, and of boarding house keepers. And I resumed, what is the very best time you ever had or have in your life? The best time I ever had or can have, he said, is when I feel a new idea, one I have never had before, coming into my mind. Then I want to share it with other people. He had the intense hatred of being interrupted that all authors and artists have, yet a gentle humility, touched with sadness or quaint jests, was to me most prominent in his character. His way of serving others was very characteristic. And then she tells this wonderful story. She says, he would neither hide nor exhibit his charities. If he met an old doctor or clergyman whom he knew and trusted at dinner or in an afternoon of relaxation, he would sidle up to him or her and extend a few bills, in a tight ball with the peculiar awkward twist of his left arm and say, here, take this. I feel about that much, but I don't know who it ought to go to. Mr. J.K. Beecher, half-brother of Henry Ward, the great orator, was Mr. Clemens' closest friend in Elmira after the death of his wife's father, to whom he was intensely attached. If he and Beecher could be got to the same dinner table or billiard table, a war of wit would ensue that would almost wake the dead. The birth of each of his children, and I failed to mention, although maybe you could kind of surmise it, but every one of the Clemens Langdon children, every one of Twain and Olivia's children was delivered or caught, as the midwives say, by Rachel Brooks Gleason. She was the only person they trusted to do that. And Adele remembers, the birth of each of his children was celebrated by a thank offering in the form of a well-cut stone trough placed at the roadside for the use of the horses as they toiled up the steep hillside, the road that you all just drove up to get here. His helpful goodness, his shrewd insight, his peculiar way of helping people just in the nick of time made the difference between success and failure, hope or despair for many hundred people during his lifetime. In his never-failing devotion to his wife, there was an element of anxious humility most touching to see. The fact that she wanted anything or that he had displeased her in any way was more absorbing to him than any honor or success in life. His wife's last request was that he should stay with Jean, their daughter, and he husbanded his failing strength in every way after her death to fulfill this request. The picture of their playing chess together shows her head as classic in its beauty as Portia's might have been. It will be the treasure of some art gallery. I've tried to find that photograph, but I believe it's lost. The tragic, or shall we say beautiful, death of this daughter must have left him with very little motive for this life. It goes on in a slightly more conventional vein. I'll share with you one last little detail, this wonderful anecdote. He used to say, "A man must be either a genius or a fool to be interesting. God spare me the average." He often said a farmer with whom he talked one evening, and this must have taken place on a farm right around here. He often said a farmer with whom he talked one evening paid him the greatest compliment he ever received. As he was parting from his chance acquaintance, he remarked, "I must go home now." "Where do you live?" asked the farmer. "Over there," said Mr. Clemens, pointing to the house. "Lord, be you him?" was the man's amazed response. I love that. She ends the piece, "Every country holds some of his personal friends who will never forget Samuel L. Clemens." I love this little piece of writing. I love that she liked and admired Sam Clemens. It's a wonderful lens through which to see him, his kindness and his generosity, and seen through the eyes of a woman who struggled very much, but accomplished very much. Adele Gleason died in an insane asylum in another part of New York, a place called Brigham Hall. She died in 1930, so she was 80 years old at the time. This is 1925. The Scribblers, this was a kind of literary political group in Buffalo, New York. And her death is reported 5 years before she actually died, which shows you the obscurity that she had fallen into. Even her old friends didn't know where she was. She was living at the asylum at this time. But you can see here they say, others who joined very soon, who joined the Scribblers, in other words. Help me find it. Where is her name in here? Gleason. Down lower. Tell me when. Keep going. There we go. Thank you. Dr. Adele Gleason, whose wandering spirit gave her a foreign grave. So they assumed that she had died in India, presumably, but she was still alive at that time. Here's a wonderful picture of her, this full-length picture that was in the newspaper in Buffalo in 1904. And here, I started with the Reverend Stan Sutton in Bayview, my friend and neighbor, And here in Elmira, I was able to meet up with his totally delightful sister, Joy Perry, who's in the crowd tonight. I won't embarrass her. But we went hunting for Adele Gleason's grave at Woodlawn Cemetery. It's quite close to Twain's own grave, or to the Twain Langdon, the Clemens Langdon plot. The individual stones are not there. You can't find Silas or Rachel or Adele for that matter. There's just this very imposing cube that says Gleason. That's Davis Street back there. So it's right on the edge of the cemetery. But it was wonderful to find that grave. And it brought the story full circle for me and gave me a chance to make a wonderful new friend in Joy Perry. So so I thank her and I thank all of you for listening to me. And that's the end of the talk.